My name is Fiza Javid, and I'm a health and wellness worker with Closer to Home Community Services. And my background is in neuroscience and psychology. And today we're here to talk about family violence and brain development. As Laura said, this is a sensitive presentation and it would have some sensitive content in it. And if you need to talk to somebody or step out, you're welcome to do so. And if you need to us to stay on to be able to talk to, we'll also be available at the end of the presentation. And I have my colleague here with me, my wonderful colleague Danielle Mayer. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Danielle Mayer. I also am a health and wellness worker at Close to Home Community Services. My background is in early childhood education. I have my child and youth psychology, as well as I am currently taking my master's in counseling.
Okay, great. So now I'm just going to turn off the video for the rest of the presentation just so you guys can hear me better. If you have any questions regarding the presentation as we're going along, you can throw them in the chat and we'll be happy to address them at the end of the presentation. So we'll just get started here. Okay, so we want to first start off by talking about what is family violence essentially. And it's generally defined as the use of abusive behavior to control or harm members of family or in relationships of trust or dependency that they endanger the survival, security, or well-being of another person. And that can include many different forms of violence. It might be physical abuse, emotional abuse, it might be in form of neglect, but essentially it's something that is carried out by family members or intimate partners. It may include a single act of violence, something that happened once, or it might be a number of acts that form a pattern of abuse. And it can have serious and sometimes fatal consequences for the victims and for those who see or hear the violence. And that's especially true for women, and you'll see in a second why.
When understanding that incidents of family violence can be serious or fatal, it's important to recognize that these effects are global. When we look at the pattern, or when we look at the image, we do see that 58% of women and girls are murdered by either their intimate partner and or family members. These stats are not only in Europe or in third world countries, they're worldwide. These effects affect everyone from all over the world, regardless of their culture, religion, and or socioeconomical status.
And on that note, it's also interesting to note that 32% of Canadian adults report that they have experienced some sort of abuse before the age of 16. So we can see that family violence is quite prevalent, and it's important to recognize what that might look like if you or someone you know experiences it. So, just want to warn here that this is not an exhaustive list for types of family violence, but these are some forms in which some people experience it. And one of them is physical violence, and that could include hitting, spitting, punching, choking, or slapping somebody, restraining them, or threatening to do anything physically harming to another human being. And emotional family violence looks like stalking, and that could be stalking even your partner, threatening, texting, or emailing them constantly to bother them, through Facebook or other social media, using manipulation and harassment to abuse somebody. And financial abuse is something that people don't really think of when it comes to family violence, but it very much is a form of abuse. And that could look like your partner or somebody you know, your family member, withholding money from you or not giving you access to your own money, not having access to financial documents or property that you share, providing an allowance when that's not something you consented to, or forcing you to sign a prenuptial agreement. Some people might argue, I want to sign a prenup agreement. How is that a type of financial abuse? But the key here is that if that's not something you consented to, and then being forced or manipulated into signing it is a form of abuse. And sexual abuse is something that we're having more and more conversation of these days, and it seems to be a bit more clear. It's forced sex, sexual acts without consent, forcing a victim to view illicit material, that could be pornography or anything, forcing you to see it with them. And lastly, neglect is another form of family violence that commonly people don't really think of when they think of domestic abuse. It's not providing proper food or warm clothing to people that you're supposed to be taking care of. So, generally, children or elderly, failure to provide adequate health care, medication, and personal hygiene. And or failure to prevent physical harm and ensuring proper supervision, especially for those young children who are vulnerable to getting in harm's way.
When we consider types of family violence, it's important to remember to trust your gut and listen to it. If something's weird, if something feels weird, that's because it probably is. I've worked with many clients who have been creative in the forms of their manipulation and violence, and once experienced a client who created a spreadsheet for feedback on how their partner could improve. Not only was this harmful and had lasting effects on the individual, but it also demonstrated to the children in the home that that type of language, treatment, and control were okay and appropriate in a childhood's household.
And that's an important conversation to have, and because when we think of children, people tend to think that just because the abuse is not being done to the child, that it's not violence committed towards them. But exposure in itself is actually a form of maltreatment. And in fact, exposure to intimate partner violence was the most common form of maltreatment of children in Canada. And it's a thing that we have to think about, that children, when they're often called witnesses to domestic violence, they're viewed as some playing a passive role, but children that live in conflict and abuse are actively involved in it. They're actively involved because they are interpreting, they're predicting, they're assessing their roles in causing a fight. And they worry about the consequences. They engage in problem solving. They take measures to protect themselves. They take measures to protect their siblings, and those measures can be both physically and emotionally. So it's very harmful to view children as mere witnesses, that are watching this happen passively. And we're about to actually show a video that does, I think it does a pretty good job of showing what that harm or trauma might look like. But I do want to warn that this is a very sensitive video. I will give you a moment to process it afterwards. Danielle, you had some words about that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, to demonstrate these effects, that we did want to play the video. The video is a 6-year-old child calling 911 while she's witnessing her mother and father in a domestic dispute. Even though myself and Fizza have seen this video many of times, we'll be the first to admit that it is an extremely heartbreaking video, and it contains content that can be triggering or upsetting to its audience. Like Laura said at the beginning, please proceed with caution and take care of yourself however you see fit. Again, at the end of the presentation, oh my goodness, right? We will be giving more resources for people who might need so.
And just before we actually jump into that video, I did want to ask, just to get a better idea of the views in the audience on some of that subject. If Laura, you could there's 5 questions. If you could just answer to the poll, that would be great, and then we'll jump right into the video. If you could show the poll questions. They should be active right now and close to a lot of us. And actually, almost 62% of you said that you know someone who has experienced domestic or family violence, and that is the majority. So just keeping that in mind before, again, I show this video, just be a bit. I will, if you need a moment, you're welcome to take that, and I'll play the video right now. That is a very difficult video to watch. And Danielle, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, again, I can appreciate equally how difficult it is to hear that video. But the reason that we're showing it to everyone is that it is necessary because this is often the reality that children face who experience family violence. In addition, this video does highlight some important points that we would like you to consider. For example, at the beginning of the tape, the little girl expresses to the operator that this has been going on forever and ever. Whether we want to believe it or not, or whether we think children are aware of family violence, this demonstrates that they are. This young girl feels that this has been going on for the 6 entire years of her short life. Later in the tape, the dispatcher asks the girl if the door is unlocked. She's screaming, she's crying throughout the tape, and all of a sudden she stops. And she says, "Just 1 minute, please." This statement is interesting because you're able to see and hear how this young girl's trauma response flipped on. She entered flight, fight, or freeze, and in that moment, her instincts take over. Lastly, the last thing that I would like to highlight is how the 911 operator at the very end says, "Shit." I apologize for my language, but this is an excellent example of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma refers to the emotional residue of exposure that helping professionals like us experience by hearing stories or witnessing the fear, pain, and terror that this trauma presents itself. That dispatcher was absolutely helpless, and we as an audience can hear it.
Thank you for sharing that, Danielle. And like I said earlier, if anyone needs a moment to speak to either of us about that, we will be available after. But the reason, as Danielle sort of hinted on it already, to talk about that is we can only imagine that trauma that children experience like that is definitely going to have some kind of effect on their brains as they're developing. And 81% of you actually did share that you do believe, yes, that family violence can and will affect brain development in children. And in the last decade, there has been a number of studies done on the effects on children that are exposed to domestic violence. And research, shows over and over again that especially in the first 5 years of life, when you're exposed to domestic violence, it can have lasting effects on brain development and behavior. And there are great researchers like Bruce Perry, Jenny Horstman, and Everly Weatherspoon that have done research on this. And you can follow those links that are provided on this website to study a bit more as it applies to whatever role that you play, whether you're a healthcare worker, whether you are a social worker, a caregiver, or a parent. It's important to have an understanding of that. And the reason we really focus on the first 5 years of life is mainly because at this point, both positive and negative experiences affect the socio-emotional and cognitive development of children, and the maturation of associated brain structures as children are growing up. And more specifically, they affect what we call the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, and that's basically composed of brain structures in our brain and our adrenal glands. But the idea is that it's a stress response system, and I'll be talking a bit more about that later in the presentation. But that, along with brain structures that are related to witnessing anything itself, so our auditory or hearing and our visual cortex involved in seeing, are severely impacting exposed children. So when we talk about, what is this impact? What does it look like? There are three things to look at. There's body, brain, and behavior. And the first thing that I think that's easiest to understand is the kind of attachment and relationships that we witness is what we understand to be the nature of relationship that we're going to have in the future. So attachments and relationships are one of the first things I think that are most intuitive to us to understand the impact on. Emotional responses in children are impacted, how they process certain emotions, how they learn to name emotions or regulate themselves. Dissociation is common, them dissociating from any given situation that they're in. It affects their self-concept, their identity, on understanding who they are, sense of belongingness. Those things are impacted, and brain development. And when we say brain development, it's a larger term, but more specifically, we know that cognition, ability to think and learn, and memory are all aspects of brain development that are impacted. There can be sensory dysregulation in terms of how they respond to actual senses, but it's whether being more sensitive to noise, being more sensitive to seeing things, are all that might be things that might be impacted. And lastly, long-term physical health.
So Bruce Perry does indicate that traumatic events increase a risk for a host of other social behaviors. Examples can include teen pregnancy, drug use, school failure, victimization, and other medical problems such as heart disease, asthma, obesity.
And now we're going to be talking more specifically. There's a lot of research that is out there that talks about, even since pregnancy, even when the child is still in the womb, is when stress markers can start to get transferred from the mother to a child. And that's really when exposure to family violence can actually start affecting development of the child. So when we look at infancy to toddlers, we're talking about 0 to 3 years of age. What normal developmental features look like in this age group is that they take in information through their senses. That's when children start to, they look at things a lot, they touch things, that's how they're learning. They start to develop attachment to their primary caregiver. They learn through play and exploration. That is their primary way of learning about the environment and stimulus around them. And they learn from what they hear and what they observe in the family. And when you add domestic violence to that mix, what it happens is that it can potentially have impacts on that development. The child at that age may be distressed by sounds of violence. They may experience compromised attachment. They might have fears and instability, which may hinder their exploration and playing stage, and therefore their ability to learn about their environment. And there are clinical studies that find that poor sleeping habits are indicative of domestic violence during this stage. Poor general health, that could be their overall weight, their appetite. These children might have high irritability and increased screaming and crying.
If you're interested in receiving more information on infants and toddlers, check out the Infant Mental Health Promotion Act created by the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto. Right now, I believe they are actually offering a free infant mental wellness program. It's the basics. I think if you look under IMH 101, that's again another course that you're able to register for free.
So looking at preschooler, so here we are looking at ages at about 3 to 5 years of age. And normal developmental features of this age are very egocentric thinking. What that means is that children at that age have not developed an ability to be able to see things from other people's perspective. They're not able yet to understand what things look like from another person's point of view. They're only able to see their own point of view and what life looks like from their point of view. And even in that regard, the thinking is very concrete, meaning it's very black and white, and it's very physical environment related. They're not yet able to understand abstract concepts. They only observe and understand what they're able to see and hear. And they learn from familiar interactions. They're learning what interactions look like while seeing interactions between mother and father, while seeing interactions between siblings and other family members in the home. And this is when overgeneralization is basically what helps their brain understand and make sense of the things around them. So what they think to be true in one situation or one aspect is what they might generalize to another situation for it to be true. And there's potential impacts of that.
So for example, as helping professionals, we will often notice this when children either blame themselves for the family violence. Because of their egocentric nature, this creates a feeling that if they just listened better or were better behaved, that their parents would no longer be fighting. This can also impact their anxiety and confusion. They can imitate what they see and hear in their family. Again, this is something that we can see during play. We can see it as they act out types in traumatic play scenarios, Barbies, or even on the playground. And they often hope that a superhero will come and save them.
School-age children. I think this is at the point when children start to have a lot more contact with people outside of their homes. So exposure tends to show a little bit more around this age in behaviors. We're looking at children all the way from 6 to, I would say, about 12 years of age. And developmental features at this age are marked by cognitive lens of fairness and rules. These children are acting on basically reward and punishment. And they're acting on it to be able to get the things they want. They know that this is how they have to behave. This is when they start to consider intent of actions of other people. They have increased identification with same-sexed parent. These are girls being daddy's girl or being a mama's boy. This is the age in which we see more of that. There's competition makes them assume increased importance, and their confidence is very much linked to school success. And potentially, if these children at that age have been exposed to domestic violence, they may begin to they attend to an internalized rationalization for abuse. So what that looks like is, I deserve to get hit, that's why I got hit. Or just internalizing whatever they're viewing, whether it's a family member degrading another person. This is when they start to see an explanation, and they internalize those explanations, and it starts to affect their confidence and self-esteem. And they may learn gender roles that are linked to domestic violence. So if they see that if the father in the home is always abusing another person in the home, then that's the role that they might more identify with if you're a male, or vice versa if you're female. And they may express competitiveness with aggression. So these are children, that engage in a lot of fighting. We see that in playgrounds. We see, repeatedly these children who seem to be troubled, and they have a hard time connecting to other people. They have hard time making friends, and and to protect themselves against that, sometimes they engage in bullying behaviors. They are going to be mean to others, whatever they're observing in their homes. We start to see that in their interactions with other people outside of home. And school success, inevitably starts to get compromised. They're tired, they're distracted, they don't have the ability to focus as much in school.
And again, if you're looking for more current research around brain development, you can check out The Brain Story. It is created by Alberta Health and Wellness Initiative. Again, it's a completely free course. It's 30 hours free. And if you're a nerd like me, you get a certificate at the end, so it's great.
Adolescence. So these are our teens. If you have any in your home, I don't think you need me to explain that this is a difficult time for for parents, for caregivers, but it's actually a harder time for teens. I think in our society we need to start to accept that it is hard to be a teenager, and more so than ever before. We're starting to see more anxiety and depression in adolescents today than we have ever seen before. And there is a reason for that. There is a brain development reason for that. This is when we start to see that these adolescents, they have increased autonomy. They want to be in control of their life, of their decisions, and they want to be making them. But the problem is that the part of the brain, what we call the frontal cortex, isn't quite developed yet for them to be able to give them enough rational thinking to make properly logical decisions, or what we might consider to be logical, rational decisions. So that is a tension that is constantly bothering adolescents. This is There's puberty and physical changes. This is when we see them engaging in dating and issues of intimacy, trying to explore sexuality. There's increased peer influence and desire for peer acceptance. This is when parents, start to notice that if their child was really close to them, it was their best friend, and the child is not sharing as much anymore. They seem to be more, spending time with their friends all the time, and these days it might be they're spending more time on the phones all the time, because that's where they're getting their validation and acceptance from. And their self-worth is more strongly linked to their appearance. Again, we see that more with social media, with pictures being posted, and that is a form of validation. Their reward system in their brain is activated through engaging in those behaviors, and they have increased capacity for abstract reasoning. Which is interesting because at this age they can actually see beyond, with thinking that involves beyond the physical environment. They're able to understand abstract concepts, but meanwhile not being able to fully understand or make rational thinking and decisions. And what happens when we add family violence to that mix is we start to see impact at this time, and impact that continues to affect them for the rest of their lives. We can see compromised negotiation skills, meaning that they're not really able to communicate, this is what I want, or this is how I feel, and therefore this is what I'm expecting. They're not really able to have those conversations. So our job as caregivers, as parents, as social workers, is to give them the skill to be able to develop that. How do you negotiate? How do you ask for anything? And but not having that, and having compromised negotiation, can increase tensions in the home with parents and between parents and teens. They may try to stop violence in their home because they have grown up. They have physically the size to be able to impose their will with physical intimidation or aggression. I've had clients, that are worried that their children are going to end up in jail if they continue seeing the behaviors that they're seeing. But this is what they have learned. And they may have difficulty because of that establishing healthy relationships. They have difficulty even determining what a healthy relationship is because that hasn't been modeled for them. They may be embarrassed and shamed by the violence. They may feel anger at either or both of the parents for the violence that they have been exposed to. And their views of self may be distorted, and they're distorted because they may have seen, their mother or their father being degraded, depending on whoever the perpetrator is in the home, and might even be due to child maltreatment. These children have in some cases have been told, you are bad, you don't deserve good things. They internalize that, and because of that, we start to see these experiences impacting them and leading to eating disorders, leading to them engaging in image management activities. So things like getting body piercings, getting tattoos, engaging in what they view as rebellious activities. And these children tend to have in adolescence very all or nothing interpretations of the world around them. Which competes with their greater capacity to see these shades of gray, which we refer to as abstract thinking. So, but their understanding is either everyone is a victim or everyone is a perpetrator. And this style of processing may be intensified by child maltreatment, especially if they're continuing to experience it, and they may be predisposed towards attitudes and values that are associated with violence and or victimization.
Now that we understand the impacts on family violence and how it links to developmental milestones that children go through, we would like to consider how these effects present themselves in the children and youth that you may work with today. So for example, there may be no apparent signs at all. This again are what RIPVISA has been referring to as internalizers. These are the children that we as professionals need to ensure we don't forget about and leave behind. There may be distributions to their sleep patterns that may be too much or too little, behavioral aggression such as home sucking, bedwetting, or baby talk, inappropriate levels of emotional reactions for certain situations, increased levels of temper tantrums, clingy behavior. Again, this can most often be seen as separation anxiety in younger children. Bullying. This is often an imitation from the previous violence or abuse that they have seen or witnessed before. Suicidal ideation and or attempts. Withdrawal, socialization, relationship breakdowns, and attitudes concerning violence. Again, this is due to the desensitization that they have experienced from the repeated exposure of the abuse and or witnessing of the violence that they have seen. Again, this can be presented in children who enjoy extremely gory movies or know more about violence than the average person their age. This also can lead to academic difficulties and PTSD.
So mechanisms of impact on the brain and how that relates to domestic violence. I understand that this is a really wordy slide over here, and some of us, have might have background in this, or other people might be like there's a lot of words here. But the core concept is really to understand that there is a very physical impact on the brain of domestic violence. And on the visual on the right is what I was speaking to earlier, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. You can see the hypothalamus there. The pituitary gland is also in the brain, and that links to the adrenal glands in our body. And that system in itself is controls a lot of hormones. And it's the HPA axis refers to as a stress response system. And cortisol is the stress hormone which activates when we experience stressors around us long term. And what happens is that the chronic activation of this stress response due to chronic exposure to stress, or having chronic exposure to violence, it causes changes in the psychological, immune, and metabolic systems in our body. And during the first 5 years of development, the HPA axis and cortisol reactivity are still maturing. That our brains are still learning how much cortisol is supposed to be released to what type of stressors. So they're highly vulnerable to outside stressors at that age. And that is one of the main reasons why domestic violence can have very long lasting and harder to treat effects on young children. Um, and the auditory cortex is the part of our brain that processes information with regards to hearing. And witnessing verbal abuse shows brain changes in those areas that are responsible for language processing, and it leads to reduction that we see in children in verbal IQ and language comprehension. And these might be children that that are not able to write or read as well. They're not able to speak as well because their language comprehension is behind what would be considered normal. And the visual cortex in our brain is responsible for processing information that we see and process with our eyes. And witnessing physical abuse has shown reduced brain volumes in the visual cortex, and actually, in fact, absence of neuronal connections. So these are our brain cells that are supposed to talk to each other between our visual cortex and our limbic system, the limbic system that is responsible for our response to when we experience a threat. And to sum it up, essentially, is what I'm trying to say is when we have our children that experience this violence around them, they have brain areas that are maturing, that are still developing, and they have still yet to learn how to respond to these stressors. And when they have been exposed to so many stressors at that age, their systems have adapted to that kind of dysfunctional release of hormones and abnormal release of hormones, such that for the rest of their lives, we start to see that impact from that exposure. And if you have any questions about this, we can come back to this. But that is what I have to say about that. And that's not to say that it's all doom and gloom from there, that there's nothing that can be done. These children have been exposed now, and brain changes have occurred, and there's nothing that we can do. There's actually quite a bit of research out there that shows that there's two critical aspects of interactions that children have their primary caregivers that are absolutely essential for brain development. And the number one aspect is that if there's a secure ongoing relationship or attachment between caregiver and child, even if it's just a single caregiver and child, that is a protective factor. Second is having a sensitive co-regulation with the caregiver in presence of a stressor to help the child develop and increase its capacity for independent emotional regulation. So what that's essentially saying is that if there's a caregiver that is, for example, soothing a child when it's being exposed to a stressor or a threat, they're going to be able to learn how to independently regulate their emotions. And sensitive caregiving and co-regulation both together have been shown to contribute to lower levels of cortisol, which is what the stress hormone that I was referring to, and that chronically can get activated and impact brain structures in these children.
The Center for the Developing Child indicates, like Fiza said, that one single caregiver is able to make the difference in a child's life by simply engaging in serve and return. Serve and return are interactions between individuals that shape the brain of the architecture of the brain. For example, if an infant babbles, cries, or gestures, the adult responds appropriately with eye contact, a word, and/or a hug.
So there are some other factors that contribute to resiliency. And what we refer to as resiliency is protecting that child essentially from the harmful effects that they might have been exposed to due to witnessing violence in their home. So that again, a strong relationship with a competent, caring, positive adult in their lives, having community safe havens. So when these children go to schools, if they're able to connect to their peers, their teacher, their counselor, going to community centers, places of worship. If these children are able to find a bond there, that can be helpful to them. And there's characteristics of children themselves. We've all been in contact with very, very resilient individuals who have been exposed to a lot of things in their life. And some people might question, these kids would have grown up to be not so they wouldn't have been as doing as well as they have been doing, and that's because there are personality characteristics themselves and temperaments of children, and characteristics like having average to above average intelligence, having good attention span and interpersonal skills, positive self-esteem, access to resources for good schooling, employment, and community activities, other environmental factors that can contribute to resiliency for these children. And this is one of the main reasons when we think that in our society that children are not being taken care of because they are vulnerable. That's when they're at the risk of being taken away from those who are responsible for taking care of them. And what I'm referring to is when authorities get involved because they believe that these children need to be protected. And that's within the Child, Youth, Family Enhancement Act. And as more and research is coming out, the more better understanding we have of brain development. It wasn't until actually in 2004 that exposure to family violence was considered recognized as a protection concern under the Child Welfare Act. Because we are learning as we go. We're learning how these children need to be protected from that. And we can see the prevalence of that is that Children's Services estimates that currently 50 to 70%, that is majority of their caseloads, include a domestic conflict component.
When we consider 50 to 70% of caseloads, it seems quite high, and a lot of individuals wouldn't believe that this takes place in Calgary, but actually that's the opposite. The prevalence in Calgary is very high. In 2007, the police responded to over 12,000 calls. Just over 3,500 were domestic-related calls, and they reported as criminal in nature, meaning that one of the individuals in this scenario could have been charged. That's leaving 8,500 cases where a call for help was made, but there was little to no follow-up performed. In 2010, CPS responded to more than 16,000 domestic-related calls for service.
Which,
Oh, sorry. Keep
sorry,
going.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, when we consider the other 8,500 cases that were a call for help that we weren't able to follow up on, we would like to present you guys with some ideas on who you could call in those scenarios.
And that's important. I think it's a very important discussion because, as most of you in the audience pointed out, saying 76% of you said that you are aware that family violence is an issue that is present in Calgary, but 32% of you also noted that you would not know who to call or who to contact, and that's what we are here to talk about. When you're having, if you know somebody who is experiencing family violence, there are resources out there in our community. There are organizations out there that are there to help and support. If it's an emergency, if somebody's life is in danger, if somebody is in danger of being hurt, then you call 911. That would be our first resource. But there are other places that you can call when you have concerns for safety, for shelter, for other proceedings. So there's a 24-hour family violence helpline. There's a distress center. There's YWCA crisis line that you can call. And Alberta government themselves have a family violence information line that's listed here, and a child abuse hotline that's available 24 hours, 7 days a week in 170 languages. And children's services, if you are aware that there's a child at risk and children's services need to be contacted, there's a number there as well, and 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. Other people that you can think of that might be worth calling for support. But if you're enrolled in programs, a lot of the organizations I know I'm aware of in Calgary have an on-call support system, even after hours. If there's a crisis in the home that needs to be addressed that doesn't require 911 emergency or ambulance, you can call them. I know Closer to Home has one, Health Services has one. So get into contact with them. And the last thing I would like to add is having a safety plan. Develop that with somebody that you can trust and you care about. Developing that plan can really help you navigate if you were in a crisis situation. How would you navigate that? Who would you call for support? And develop that with people. So and share that with the people that are there to support you, whether that's your friend or somebody that you trust. It's your teacher. It's a parent, whoever it is. Try and get them in on this plan so they know who should be contacted if you were ever in crisis.
I would also just like to note on that last slide, if you don't understand what a safety plan is or would need help creating one of those, honestly, if you put safety plan family violence into Google search, a lot of ideas, checklist things will come up. A huge one to look for is signs of safety, or SOS. They have a very explicit version that you can go through. But if you just forget that and put it into Google search, often they will have lots of ideas for you. Furthermore, Calgary also has lots of larger systems at play. So we have Victim Services Alberta. They help with information, services, and referrals for victims. There is the Government of Alberta High Risk Management Initiative. Again, they help with safety planning as well as safety monitoring. The Calgary Women's Shelter, Calgary Specialized Domestic Violence Courts, Community Safe Visitation through YWCA and their Family Violence Prevention Center. As of right now, this is the only safe visitation site that I am aware of in Calgary, and that is very good to use for people who are having a sticky divorce, or if there has been no contact orders or anything involved in that case. They will actually take the child, walk them through a specialized locked room, and then they will drop off to the other parent so that there's never any contact between either individual. Case management can be through Homefront Calgary, Calgary Counseling, the Distress Center. Again, there are lots of other shelters to look into, such as Sunshine, Brenda's House, Discovery House.
And for more resources, you can visit the link that I have provided on here, but I believe you all should have received in your email a PDF version of all these community programs and resources with current numbers that you can contact and their hours of operation. But if you have any trouble, getting into contact with any of them, there will be contact information for us at the end as well. And just as the last thing, that I just want to give a moment to and a thought to is something that was a bit of an eye opener for myself as well. Is that 62% of you did say that you are aware that family violence in the home, even if children don't witness it themselves, they are aware of it. And there's a really interesting quote here that says that sometimes the only thing worse than what the children witness is what they imagine from their hiding places. And it's something that I just want to leave out here to give some thought to and hear if some people have any ideas and thoughts on that. Danielle, did you have anything to add to
Yeah.
this? Or?
Sorry, I was just clicking the unmute. I don't, and if anyone else would like to share, but for more, something that I often think of when I think about children who are hiding or from parents who think that their children are not witnessing domestic violence, is a very clear image of a child who has probably gone to bed already. He or she has snuck out and is now currently sitting on the stairs to kind of see what's going on in the kitchen with mom and dad. Unfortunately, there has been some sort of argument due to anything. Maybe dinner wasn't ready. That's a horrible example, but if dinner wasn't ready and all of a sudden it turns into a fight where maybe there was slapping, hitting, screaming, crying, even though that child is sitting on top of the stairs and maybe isn't able to witness what's going on in the kitchen, he can see shadows, he can hear things, and he's still impacted by the loud noises and sounds and scariness that's going around him.
Thanks for sharing that, Danielle. I think that really sheds a light on just another point that's really to take home from here is that children are really vulnerable and they are developing at this point, and their brain needs to be protected for them to turn into healthy adults. And we as a society are here to make sure that those children are supported. Now, I think I would just like to open the floor to any questions. And before people pop off of here, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this. I hope it was helpful. And if you could please remember to complete our evaluation survey. It's on Google Forms. It was sent as a link to everybody. If you don't have it, I can drop it into the chat. It would be really helpful for us when we are preparing our future presentations to understand what people who were our attendees and what they would like to hear from us. So please take the time to do that. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and throw them into the chat. If you don't want to, I will turn my video on in just a second. Just wanted to point this out here. Our email is communityconnections@closertohome.com. If you want to contact us, you can get connected also through social media, which we're pretty active on. We have communityconnections.cth on Facebook and on Instagram.